Welcome back to The Explainer. So let's talk about addiction. When you hear that word, what's the first thing that comes to mind? For most of us, it's probably a specific drug or a drink. But what if the real story is much, much bigger than that? Today, we're going to pull back the curtain and look at the universal pattern that drives all addiction, no matter what its face looks like.
You know, before we jump into all the neuroscience, we have to start right here, with this feeling. This quote just cuts right to the heart of it, doesn't it? That raw human experience. It's not about seeking a party, it's about desperation. It's about a search for any possible way to just stop the pain and finally exhale.
All right, so here's our plan for today. First, we'll do a quick refresher on the brain science, that tricky dopamine deal we've talked about before. Then, we're going to look at the two major paths addiction takes. We'll explore the whole spectrum of substances, and then dive into the maze of behaviors. And we'll wrap it all up by asking a really big question that might just change how you see this whole thing.
Okay, first up, dopamine's deceptive deal. To really get a handle on any kind of addiction, we've got to go back to basics, back to that core engine running under the hood, the brain's fundamental pleasure-pain balance.
You know, the neuroscientist Dr. Judith Grizzle puts it perfectly. In the brain, there is no free lunch. Seriously, our brain is basically a super strict accountant. For every bit of pleasure you experience, it immediately puts an equal amount of pain on the other side of the ledger to keep things balanced. It's always trying to get back to zero, back to that neutral state called homeostasis.
And this is where the trap is set. It all starts with a huge spike of pleasure, right? That's step one. But remember that brain accountant? It sees that spike and goes, whoa, nope, and releases a flood of anti-pleasure chemicals to bring you crashing back down. But here's the catch. The pleasure fades fast, but that feeling of pain, that anxious, craving state, it sticks around. So what's the quickest way to feel better? Go back to the source of pleasure. And just like that, the loop gets deeper and stronger every single time.
This quote from Dr. Nicole LeBur, wow, it just nails the feeling of compulsion. Because when that craving state takes over, it's not really you thinking anymore. It's your primitive, survival-focused midbrain screaming, I need this to live. It's like a hostile takeover. It completely shoves aside your rational brain, the part that cares about your family, your job, your future, and makes it feel like there is literally no other choice. It feels like a biological imperative.
Okay, so we get the mechanism, we see how the trap works, but how does this trap actually show up in the real world? Well, it turns out there are two main highways that all lead to the exact same problematic destination.
So on one hand, you have what everyone thinks of first, substance addiction. This is when you're putting an external chemical into your body to directly mess with your brain's wiring. But that is only one side of the coin. On the other side, you have behavioral addiction. And this is where things get really interesting, because here, you're hijacking that same exact system, but with one of your own repeated actions.
And this is maybe the single most important thing to get today. Your brain, it really doesn't care where that dopamine spike comes from. It does not distinguish whether it's a chemical you smoke or the thrill you get from an action. The downstream effect, that compulsive drive, even when your life is falling apart, can be pretty much identical.
All right, let's break these two paths down a little more. We'll start with the one most of us are familiar with, the wide, wide world of substance addiction. Man, the list of addictive substances is just staggering. They're often sorted into these two big buckets. You've got the downers, or depressants, like alcohol, opioids, and benzos, like Xanax. They slow everything down. Then you've got the uppers, the stimulants, cocaine, meth, MDMA, that do the exact opposite. They crank everything up to 11, creating these intense bursts of energy. But it's not just uppers and downers, not by a long shot. The list goes on and on. You have things like cannabis, psychedelics, and all sorts of synthetic compounds like GHB. Now, the experience of using these can feel wildly different, of course, but underneath it all, they share one crucial and dangerous ability. They all know how to find the backdoor to that pleasure-pain cycle and hijack the system.
Okay, but remember, substances are only half the story. Now we get to the other path, the one that's a lot trickier and, frankly, less understood. This is where the compulsion comes not from a chemical, but from something you do. It's kind of a wild thought when you first hear it, right? That our own actions can become addictive. But it's absolutely true. Any behavior that gives your brain a big, unnatural jolt of dopamine over and over again can kickstart that exact same compulsive loop we saw with substances. And just look at this list. Gambling, gaming, food, sex, porn. Part of what makes these so insidious is how normal they are. They're literally woven into our culture. But for some people, the way these activities deliver rewards, especially unpredictable rewards, can light up those brain circuits just as brightly as any drug, creating that same desperate need for more. Now, hearing all this, it's easy to think that cycle sounds impossible to break. And it can really feel that way. But that brings us to this number, 75%. What's that? Well, according to major studies, that's roughly the percentage of people who recover from addiction without any formal treatment. Think about that. 3 out of 4. That tells us something incredibly hopeful about the brain. It has this remarkable built-in capacity to heal, to change, and to unlearn even these deeply powerful habits.
Okay, so we've seen the two big paths, substances and behaviors. Now let's zoom out one last time and try to see the big picture. What is addiction really, when you strip away all the specifics? This is where the neuroscientist Mark Lewis comes in with a really powerful idea. He suggests that maybe we should think about addiction not as a disease, but as a form of learning, a very powerful, very deep, and ultimately very destructive form of learning that our brains are actually designed to be excellent at.
The analogy he uses is just perfect. Imagine rain falling on a dirt hill. At first, the water spreads out, but eventually it finds a little groove. And every time it rains, that water flows down the same path, carving the groove deeper and deeper until it becomes a canyon. That's your brain on addiction. The habit carves such a deep neural pathway that it becomes the default, the easiest, and eventually the only path to take. So here's the big takeaway. This isn't a picture of a broken brain. The brain isn't failing. In a weird way, it's succeeding too well. It's become frighteningly, terrifyingly efficient at doing one thing, pursuing that one goal, to the point where it pushes everything and everyone else aside. And that leaves us with a final, really provocative question we have to ask ourselves. If what we're looking at is a natural process of learning gone haywire, if it's the brain just doing its job but on the wrong target, then why on earth do we so often treat it like a moral failing, a character flaw? That is the question we're going to tackle head-on next time. We're going to take everything we've learned today about the brain and use it to bust some of the biggest myths and misconceptions out there about addiction. It's going to be a good one. We'll see you then.